of Marketing and Community Engagement at the Summit. We're so glad that you're here to join us today. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Restrooms are through the back door, and then you'll turn around and go downstairs and you'll see the signs once you get there. Coffee at the back. Feel free to get up and grab a cup if you need one. There's also water back there. If you didn't have a chance to register at the front door, I think we had several people come through the back entrance. We'll have notebooks going around during the event. Please make sure that you sign in so that we know how many people were here today. We do have grants that help cover the cost for events like this, so we need to be able to track the number of people that we have in the room. Also, I want to thank Alpharetta Methodist Church for hosting us here today. They have allowed us to be here for the last 2 years. Let's give a hand to Austin for the wonderful job that he does on our presentations and the fact that they just let us use this space here. We're so grateful to them. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today. Dr. Amanda Giordano is an associate professor at the University of Georgia who specializes in addictions counseling. She is the sole author of a clinical reference book titled A Clinical Guide to Treating Behavioral Addictions, co-author of a textbook titled Addiction Counseling, A Practical Approach, and developer of an online course working with behavioral addictions through Mental Health Academy. Dr. Giordano works to advance the counseling field with rigorous research and has published over 60 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. In 2018, she received the Addictions Offender Educator of Excellence Award from the International Association of Addictions and Offender Counselors, and in 2022, she was awarded the Russell H. Yini Jr. Research Award from her college. Dr. Giordano collaborates with domestic and international organizations to provide trainings to increase awareness related to behavioral addictions. You can follow her on Psychology Today, where she maintains a blog titled Understanding Addiction. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Amanda. Thank you.
All right, great. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here with you today because I believe this is such an important topic for us all to be aware of. So I probably have more information than what we'll get to in our 2-hour time slot, but you have these slides that has all of the information on it, as well as my email address. I really encourage you, if you have questions after today or if you're interested in more resources, please reach out to me. I enjoy having this conversation and I would like to continue it with you if you're interested, and I definitely can direct you to some fantastic resources if there's a specific behavioral addiction that you're interested in learning more about. So before we get started, I'd just like to know who's in the room. So if you are a counselor or a mental health professional, can you raise your hand? Fantastic. If you are here as a community member, a parent, raise your hand. Okay. And then anyone I'm missing? Faith community members? Okay. Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here and spending some time with me. A little bit about me, you heard from the intro, but what I like to emphasize is I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I was trained in addictions counseling in a chemical addictions treatment facility. So I worked in an intensive outpatient program for substance use disorders. And when I had my first client who said he believed he was addicted to pornography, I quickly thought, I don't know how to treat that. Like, I have not been trained on behavioral addictions. I've been trained in substance use disorders and chemical addictions. So that was about 13 or 14 years ago now. And so since that time, I've been very passionate about trying to get information to the public and to clinicians about how to address behavioral addictions, especially when you see some of the prevalence rates. You'll understand that this is such an important issue and is going to impact a lot of our clients. So that's my background. I teach courses at UGA, Go Dogs, and I've also written a couple of things. I'm really passionate about trying to get information out there. I am also a middle child, so I love presenting. I could do it all day long. It's like the Amanda Show right now, and I just love it. So thank you for being here and indulging me. Okay, so what are we going to cover in the time we have together today? There's a couple of things I want us to get through. First, I want to talk about how to identify behavioral addictions, because one of the criticisms with behavioral addictions is that we're just going to pathologize everything. If you do something a lot, does that mean you are addicted to it? So we're really going to talk about how to identify behavioral addictions. And then I want to give you a way to think about them. This conceptualization, I think, is so important, not only for those of you who are practicing and in the mental health field, but also just for the community to understand, why do some people really struggle with gaming or really struggle with pornography and other people don't? So it'll help us understand behavioral addictions. And then we'll spend our last hour talking about gaming, social media, and cybersex in particular, and I'll leave you with some resources. Okay, sound good? You ready? All right, let's do it. So let's start off by talking about the prevalence of behavioral addictions. This is why I very firmly believe that all people should be informed about behavioral addictions, because look at some of these prevalence rates. My research team and I, we did a study last year, and we asked American adolescents a variety of questions, but one of them was, how old were you when you were exposed to pornography for the first time? And that could have been intentional exposure or accidental exposure. And we found that the average age of first pornography exposure was 11 and a half years old. And that number continues to get younger. When we look at previous research projects over the years, this is getting younger and younger. So for those of you who work with youth, being able to talk about and address pornography and pornography addiction is so important. Also, non-suicidal self-injury. So some people call it self-harm. The most prevalent form is cutting behaviors. In some cases, this can be conceptualized as a behavioral addiction. And so 17.2% of adolescents across the globe have engaged in non-suicidal self-injury at some point in their lifetimes. That's a substantial number of adolescents. And then also a recent meta-analysis looking at adolescents in 33 different countries found that 8.8% of adolescents met criteria for gaming addiction. And so not just problematic gaming, but actually meeting the criteria for an addiction. So again, these are large numbers compared to other mental health concerns and even other addictions. Looking at the college community, 14.7% of Chinese college students met criteria for social media addiction. Among US college students, 11% met criteria for sex addiction. We did another study and we found that 10% of a different sample met criteria specifically for cybersex addiction. So that would be any sexual activity or stimulation using technology or a device. And then what about for folks who work out in the community? So lifetime problem or pathological gambling rates range from 0.4% to up to 4.2%, depending upon the population and the country that's being studied. Almost 8% of German adults met criteria for food addiction, and then shopping addiction, the rates are around 5%. So all of those statistics, just to say, I'm really glad you're here. I think that behavioral addictions impact a substantial number of individuals across the globe, so we have to be informed and we have to know how to work with it. So I spent more time than I'd like to admit creating this graphic of a tree with a lot of text boxes around it. But what I was trying to show is that a lot of scholars, and I agree with this view, believe that addiction is one disorder that can manifest in a variety of ways. So if you think about addiction as kind of being the root of this tree, and it could manifest as food addiction, as cannabis use disorder, as social media addiction, as alcohol use disorder, it's impacting the same region of the brain as we're going to talk about today. It is causing the release of neurochemicals, specifically dopamine, which you may have heard of. It's a neurotransmitter or a messenger chemical in the brain. It used to be called the pleasure neurotransmitter. Now we know it's a little bit more complex than that. Dopamine is involved in a lot of different aspects of who we are as individuals and movement. It's also involved in desiring a reward or anticipating a reward, but we know that dopamine is a really important chemical in addiction. So both internet gaming and substance use cause a spike of dopamine release in the same region of the brain. So it affects individuals across the lifespan, so no matter what population you work with, it's important that you understand behavioral addictions. And if behavioral addictions are unrecognized or unaddressed, then you might not see the treatment gains that you're hoping for in your clinical work, because they might come to counseling and say, I'm seeking services with marital conflict or depression or suicidal ideation, but the root cause is actually a behavioral addiction. So this gentleman that I worked with in a college counseling center, on his intake paperwork, his presenting concerns were depression and suicidal ideation. And so I'm like, okay, I know how to work with these things. So we start talking and get to the root of what some of those depressive feelings are like. We come up with a safety plan. We do all of these things. It wasn't until session 6, after we had built rapport, that he said, the reason I have these suicidal thoughts, the reason for my depression is I have a sex addiction. I am addicted to pornography use as well as offline sexual encounters. And that totally changed the course of my work with him. Thankfully, my supervisor at the time was a certified sex addiction therapist, so he was able to help me kind of work through this particular case, but just working on the depression and the suicidal ideation would not have been enough. We needed to get to that core issue, which for him was sex addiction. So one of the things I would love for you to leave here with is this understanding that addiction at its core is really about changing how a person feels. So people with addiction become addicted to changing how they feel, whether that's with drugs of abuse or addictive behaviors. They can make us feel good and give us a temporary escape from feeling bad. So people who are in treatment for behavioral addictions and for substance use disorders, a big part of treatment is helping them learn how to manage their emotions, how to regulate their emotions without turning to a drug of abuse or an addictive behavior. So that's kind of a spoiler for the end here when we talk about prevention. I believe that a great prevention strategy for behavioral addictions is training all kids to recognize that they can identify their emotions, they can put a label on it, they can express it, but they can also change it. They can change how they feel. We typically learn how to do that in the first few years of life as we're co-regulating our emotions with an attuned caregiver. But for whatever reason, there are a lot of kids who don't have that experience. They don't learn that they can successfully modify their emotional experiences. Then when they come across a drug of abuse or a potentially addictive behavior that makes them feel great and for a little bit of time gives them an escape from depressive feelings or anxious feelings or trauma symptoms, that becomes the primary way they know how to regulate their emotions. So prevention strategy is teaching these emotion regulation skills before they come across a drug of abuse or a behavioral addiction. Okay. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of how can a behavior be addictive. So I do this presentation a lot, and sometimes I have folks who would say, okay, Amanda, but I fold laundry all the time. Am I addicted to folding laundry? Or I brush my teeth every day. Am I addicted to brushing my teeth? And so we do need to clarify what we mean by a behavioral addiction. Just because you engage in something a lot or regularly does not mean you have a behavioral addiction. We're going to talk about the specific criteria in just a moment. But the other kind of question that I get, especially from folks who are trained in the substance use disorder field, is I understand how you can become addicted to a drug of abuse because you're ingesting something, your body becomes dependent on it, you have withdrawal if you stop using it. That makes sense to me. But how do you get addicted to a behavior when you're not ingesting anything? The best way I've come to answer this is to explain that drugs of abuse, they are exogenous chemicals, meaning they originate outside of the body. So things like cannabis, alcohol, heroin, they originate outside of the body. When they are taken in, they activate reward circuitry in the brain. So when we think about our brains, if you think about the very front, this is the prefrontal cortex. That is the part that's involved in executive functioning, logic, reason, rational thinking, goal-oriented behavior, all of those things that make us human. But behind that, in the mid region of the brain, that's where we find our reward circuitry. So it's a little bit more primitive than our prefrontal cortex. But this is the area of the brain where we see the release of dopamine, and it follows a pathway. So sometimes it's called the mesolimbic dopaminergic pathway. You can use that with your friends if you want to just impress them later on at a social event. But this is a little bit deeper in the brain, kind of behind our ears. So when we ingest a drug of abuse, it causes the release of endogenous chemicals, or chemicals that originate inside our body, specifically these neurotransmitters, these messenger chemicals like dopamine and other chemicals that are implicated in the experience of reward. So we take in the drug of abuse, it causes the release of these neurochemicals, and that is what is so reinforcing. It causes feelings of euphoria and pleasure, and we avoid feelings of pain and distress while it's in our system. Now, certain behaviors, not all behaviors, but certain behaviors activate this same region of the brain. Just by engaging in the behavior, it causes the release of dopamine and those other neurotransmitters that are implicated in the experience of reward without needing to ingest an exogenous chemical. Instead, it's an activity that causes the release of these endogenous chemicals, dopamine and others. So, it's not all behaviors, it's just certain behaviors that cause the release of dopamine and activate our reward circuitry. It's also not going to affect everyone the same way. So you may know there are some people who can game and do it recreationally. They don't have negative consequences. They're not doing it in a compulsive way. They haven't lost control. And then there are others who have lost everything due to gaming. They might need residential treatment because of gaming disorder. And so why do some people end up with a behavioral addiction and others don't? We have to pay attention to individual characteristics as well. There are certain risk factors that make some individuals more vulnerable or more susceptible to a behavioral addiction than others. Some of those risk factors are genetic predisposition. So we know that about 40 to 60% of addiction is linked to genes, to genetics. So when I used to work in addictions treatment, when our clients would come in, one of the first things we would do is have them draw a genogram or 3 generations of their family and have them just circle or highlight anyone who struggled with any kind of addiction, whether that was substance use or a behavioral addiction. And you could see that it runs in families. There is a genetic component to addictive behaviors. But genes are just a part of the equation. They're not the whole equation, they're just a part of it. So along with genetic predisposition, other risk factors include early exposure to the addictive behavior, particularly while the brain is still developing. So I don't know how many of you work with adolescents, but when we think about adolescent brain development, we know that the brain matures until age, what? Does anyone know? Yes, and everyone who works with adolescents is like, that explains so much. But the brain matures from the back to the front. And when we say matures, we're really talking about a process called myelination, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But this is a maturation process that starts from the base of our brain, which is really the brain stem that all those things that keep us alive, like our heart beating and breathing, all those basic primitive behaviors. It moves up through the midbrain, which is where we have our fight or flight response, our reward circuitry, emotional processing, and then it finishes around 25 with the prefrontal cortex. And what did we say that did? Yes. Executive functioning, reasoning, self-regulation, goal-oriented behavior, that's actually the last part of the brain to fully mature. So if any of you are like, wow, why are these adolescents so dramatic? It's because that's the part of their brain that's working faster than the logic reasoning part of the brain. They need our help to slow them down a little bit and think through consequences because that part of the brain is not working as fast as the pleasure, reward, emotional part of the brain. So early exposure to either a drug of abuse or a behavioral addiction is concerning because the brain is still developing, it's still maturing, and when you throw in this really powerful, stimulating experience, that can actually cause changes in brain development. That's why, if you put on kind of your advocacy hat, it is really important for us, mental health professionals and community members, to care about the activities that our kids are engaging in and our youth are engaging in, especially when a lot of these activities have addiction potential, like gaming and social media use, but they're also marketed towards young people. And so that's where we can step in and say, let's talk on behalf of this vulnerable population that's going up against these very powerful stimuli that have addiction potential. So early exposure matters, genetic predisposition is a risk factor. Also trauma. So we'll talk about that. There is a robust relationship between early trauma and the development of any type of addiction, but we'll focus on the behavioral addictions today. And then finally, another risk factor that increases an individual's susceptibility to addiction is co-occurring mental health concerns. So we see that link between mental health concerns and addictive behaviors, and there are several hypotheses as to why. Sometimes the addiction starts first, sometimes the mental health concern starts first, sometimes they occur simultaneously with a common risk factor, but that is another aspect, a characteristic of an individual that could increase their susceptibility to addiction. So sometimes I have parents ask me, okay, just tell me, yes or no, is gaming good or bad? Is social media good or bad? I just need to know, do I have to outlaw it in my household or not? And unfortunately, that's a little bit too simplistic of a question. We always have to think about these potentially addictive behaviors on this continuum, ranging from just recreational engagement on one side all the way to pathological engagement on the other side. And I always tell parents, like, you know your child, you know their individual characteristics. What type of risk factors do they have that might make them more susceptible to the development of a behavioral addiction? That's something to keep in mind. What is appropriate for your 12-year-old might be very different from what's appropriate for the 12-year-old down the street. So when we think about this continuum of behavior, on the recreational side, these are individuals that can engage in potentially addictive behaviors like gaming, social media use, cyber sex, gambling. We'll talk about quite a few of them today. They can engage and they don't meet the criteria for a behavioral addiction. So they are not experiencing negative consequences from their engagement. They have control over their engagement. They can stop when they need to. It's not compulsive, meaning that it's intentional when they plan to engage. And they have a lot of other ways to regulate their emotions. So they have like this toolbox of emotion regulation skills, and perhaps gaming from time to time or scrolling social media can be one way to change how they feel, but they have a lot of other ways too. That would be the recreational engagement. And the majority of individuals who engage in these behaviors are going to be on this side of the continuum. But the ones who show up in our offices, the ones who are looking for help and support, are going to be on the other side under pathological engagement. So some of the signs that an individual is moving towards a behavioral addiction is that the activity has become compulsive. So what I mean by that is it's not planned and it's not intentional anymore. It is the result of a really strong urge that they may engage in inappropriate times or risky times because they can't resist this really strong urge to engage. That's the compulsivity. But then we also see a loss of control. So perhaps these individuals have set limits for themselves. I'm only going to game for an hour, and then I'm going to stop and do my homework. Or I'm only going to check social media at certain times of the day. I'm not going to check social media while driving. They have these limits that they break. So they're breaking their own rules, their own limits, showing this loss of control. We also see individuals needing to engage in the behavior more frequently and for longer durations of time as tolerance builds, and so that loss of control gets more and more exacerbated. And then finally, we see when the individual is not engaging, they have cravings for this activity. So when they're not engaging in sexual activity, they may be fantasizing about sexual activity or remembering the last time they engaged. It is so mentally preoccupying that they actually can't be in the present moment. It's difficult to have a conversation and be present because they are so consumed with thoughts about this behavior. So that's the craving and mental preoccupation part. And then the big, I think, telltale sign is when individuals continue despite these negative consequences. So oftentimes, we change our behavior when we experience a negative consequence. If I am speeding, I get pulled over, and I have to pay this fine, that tells me you shouldn't speed anymore. You don't want that negative consequence, so I change my behavior. For people with a behavioral addiction, they experience negative consequences, but they're unable to change their behavior. Maybe they've tried lots of times and they're unsuccessful because they've lost control, it's compulsive at this point. So they continue to experience negative consequences in their relationships, in their finances, in their physical health, in their spirituality, in their occupational goals or educational goals, but they continue despite all of those negative consequences. That's another big sign of addiction. So that leads us to the 4 C's model. I like this model. This is the one I teach my students because I think it's really easy to remember. It's a helpful tool. When people say, can I get addicted to brushing my teeth or can I get addicted to skydiving, I always go back to this 4 C's model. So are you noticing the 4 hallmarks of addiction in your client's life? That it's become compulsive, continued despite negative consequences, they're experiencing a loss of control, and they're experiencing these cravings or mental preoccupation when they're not engaging in this behavior. So just a little aside, I do not talk to people on planes. I know that makes me sound like a terrible person. It's like, why? And why would you share that? This is being streamed. But I actually walk onto planes with my headphones in just to kind of send the message. I don't want to do small talk. Because what I have found is when I'm sitting next to someone and they're like, oh, so what do you do? I'm always like, I'm a teacher. And they're like, what do you teach? And so I finally get down to addictions. Whenever you tell someone that you do something with addictions, they want to tell you a behavior that they engage in that they're concerned about and want you to tell them, is this okay? I just can't do that for 3 hours at a time anymore. It just got too much. I was like, I don't need to hear about your sexual history. Where is like 3 more hours until we get to Dallas. But so I have stopped talking to people on planes, but when I used to, I would always go back to the 4 C's model. They would say, listen to this odd behavior I feel like I am losing control over. Do you think I have a behavioral addiction? I say, okay, is it compulsive? Have you lost control? What negative consequences are you experiencing? Are you craving it when you're not engaging? If so, maybe you should find a counselor who is not me. And I'm gonna go back to sleep. But this is a great model to help us differentiate between just high involvement in a behavior, we were talking earlier, there are professional gamers now. So there are kids, high schoolers, who are getting scholarships to college to play on their esports team. They may game for 6 hours a day, 8 hours a day. Time spent is not enough to warrant a label of a behavioral addiction. We have to see these 4 C's. And if you are listening to a client talk or you're listening to someone talk and you start hearing, okay, so they've tried to set limits, they're breaking it, they've lost control, it's becoming compulsive, you're starting to hear the negative consequences, but they haven't changed behavior, and then you're hearing those withdrawal symptoms or craving or mental preoccupation when they're not engaging, that should alert you that there could be a behavioral addiction here, and you can follow up with proposed diagnostic criteria or a formal assessment, of which there are plenty in the behavioral addictions world. Okay, so let's talk about how to conceptualize these behavioral addictions. And I think this is really helpful not only for our work with clients, but to explain to the community. There is still a lot of adherence to what we call the moral model of addiction in society. And the moral model is this idea that addiction is a personal choice, that you could stop anytime you want. Since you haven't stopped, you must be selfish or lazy or have a character flaw, a moral failing of some kind. Even though alcoholism was first called a disease back in the 1950s, we still have so many people in society thinking about addiction from the moral model. That this was, you woke up one day and thought, I'm gonna ruin my life and everyone else's, and I'm gonna, dive into this substance use or behavioral addiction. We know that that is not true. Addiction is a very complex disorder that has a lot of contributing factors. So if we can talk about the model I'm going to show you to our communities, it can move us away from that moral model of addiction and embrace more of a biopsychosocial model of addiction, which is, put simply, the biopsychosocial model is just acknowledging that there are biological, psychological, and social or environmental factors that contribute to one's risk of developing addiction. It's not just about morality. We're moving away from that and acknowledging that this has implications for how your brain works, for how we learn, and for how we manage stress and deal with our environment. So we're going to talk about the public health model as applied to behavioral addiction. So I'm going to walk us through this and then see if you have any questions. So the public health model, this was first proposed as a way to understand infectious diseases. And so from that stance, the agent would be the infectious disease, the germ, the pathogen, the thing that causes the illness. That would be the agent. The host from this model is the individual that is susceptible to that disease. So the host is the one that becomes exposed to that pathogen or that germ and develops the disease. The environment is where the agent and the host meet. So how did that person get exposed to this germ or pathogen? And then the vector, this refers to the mechanism that transmits the germ or the pathogen to the host. So when you're thinking about infectious diseases, that could be like a mosquito or a tick or something that transmits the germ or pathogen. So that is a great way to think about infectious diseases, but it's also been applied to addiction. So all the citations on this slide, they have applied this public health model to addiction, and we're gonna apply it specifically to behavioral addictions. So from our perspective, looking at behavioral addictions, the agent is not a germ or a pathogen, but it is the potentially addictive behavior, the rewarding behavior that has addiction potential. So this helps us answer the question, can any behavior lead to an addiction? And the answer is no. Not all behaviors have the same level of addiction potential. Instead, it's those behaviors that activate the reward circuitry in the brain. So remember, the reward circuitry is in the midbrain, the limbic region, so it's kind of between our ears, following the pathway of dopamine, that neurochemical messenger chemical. It's a neurotransmitter. So once an individual engages in a stimulating, rewarding behavior like gambling or gaming, there is a release of dopamine and other neurotransmitters that are implicated in the experience of reward. And so we experience reward from that behavior, and it is both positively and negatively reinforcing. Positive reinforcement is just adding something desirable that increases the probability that you'll engage in that behavior again. So if a student does well on a spelling test and you give them a sticker, that's positive reinforcement. If someone engages in gambling and they have this thrill and excitement and pleasure from the experience, that's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is when you take away something undesirable, and it still increases the probability that you're going to engage in that behavior again. The best example of this, it came from a student of mine who was really struggling with positive and negative reinforcement. They both mean they're increasing the probability of something. But negative reinforcement, if you think about when you get in your car to drive, before you put your seatbelt on, there's that annoying beeping sound. And then when you put your seatbelt on, it goes off. That's negative reinforcement. It's taking away something undesirable that increases the probability you're going to put your seatbelt on the next time you get in the car. So these behavioral addictions, when we are engaging in these activities, not only are they pleasurable and euphoric and giving us this thrill or this rush, they also provide an escape from negative mood states like depression or anxiety or trauma symptoms or loneliness or feelings of low self-esteem. We get an escape from that as well. So these behaviors are both positively and negatively reinforcing. That is how powerful they are. They are hard to walk away from because of the fact that they're positively and negatively reinforcing. So let's just take social media, for example. How many of you have a social media account? It's okay, I do too. I'm not shaming, it's a safe space. Okay, we all have social media accounts. So what makes social media positively reinforcing? What feels good about social media? Say that again? Yes, connections. What else? Likes, yep. Just watching funny videos, right? A panda rolling down a hill, it brings you some joy. You're like, oh, that's delightful. I'm glad I saw that today. So there are lots of things about social media that are specifically designed to give us pleasure. So that the likes, the connections, the funny things that we see, the really short videos that don't take up too much of our attention, all of those things are pleasurable. How is social media negatively reinforcing? What does it help you escape from? Yeah, yes, all of those things. So when we're bored, we're on social media. When we can't sleep, we're on social media. When you're feeling lonely, you can distract yourself by scrolling. When you're not feeling good about yourself, but then you post a picture and you get a lot of likes, you feel better. You don't have those maybe depressive feelings or negative thoughts about yourself. Social media is positively and negatively reinforcing, again, making it very powerful. The last thing I want to mention about these potentially addictive behaviors, these agents, is that almost all of them have some element of variable ratio reinforcement scheduling. Now, you may remember that from when you took like a theories class and learned about behaviorism, but when we talk about variable ratio reinforcement, all that means is you know a reward is coming, but you don't know when. So you keep engaging in the behavior thinking, is it this time? Is it this time? Is it this time? Dopamine gets released in anticipation of reward. So it's a very powerful experience to be anticipating a reward. Now, the counter to variable ratio reinforcement is fixed ratio. So if I get a paycheck every 2 weeks, that's still rewarding. I still feel good when I get that paycheck. But if I find $10 while I'm walking on the street that I wasn't anticipating, you actually can feel more excitement from that $10 than you do from your paycheck because it was an unexpected reward. This is how gambling works, right? You're sitting in front of an electronic gambling machine and you're thinking, I know payouts are coming, they have to because of how this is structured, but is it this time? Is it this time? Is it this time? So you stay and you play and you play and you play in anticipation of when this reward is coming. You don't know when it's coming, but you know that it is. Another way this happens is with social media. So think about, oh, did I go ahead here? Yep. I want to be right here. Okay. When you think about posting something on social media, let's say you take a picture and you think, oh, my hair looked pretty good in that. I'm going to post it online. And you're like, I'm sure I'm going to get likes. I just don't know when. So we check, and then we wait a few minutes, and then we check again, and then we wait a few minutes, and we check again. It keeps us coming back and coming back because we know rewards are coming, but we don't know when. That is an intentional aspect of social media. Like, can you imagine, I just asked my students this the other day, what would social media be like if there was no feedback option? You couldn't like anything, you couldn't heart anything, you couldn't retweet or share. And my students are like, oh, I wouldn't even do it then. This was a design choice to say, let's quantify people's appreciation of what you put online through likes and hearts and shares. And that has become a social reward. It actually gives us dopamine. We feel good when we see those likes. So it becomes just like gambling. When is that like going to come? So I'm going to check and check and check and stay on social media for a long time because I'm anticipating these rewards. So that's what variable ratio reinforcement scheduling is. I like this quote about Instagram. It says, Instagram is addictive, for example, because some photos attract many likes while others fall short. Users chase the next big hit of likes by posting one photo after another. So this variable ratio reinforcement scheduling, it is very powerful and very difficult to extinguish when it comes to reinforcement schedules. We see it in gambling, we see it in social media, we also see it in gaming. So you may be familiar with loot boxes. It's something that you can spend real currency in a game to purchase this mystery box that may have something helpful in it for you to level up, or it may not. It's really a form of gambling inside of the game. And that is variable ratio reinforcement scheduling. It is intentionally put in there to, again, keep users engaged for longer. Now, this was a lot to think about with potentially addictive behaviors, this agent part of the conceptualization. The rest of them will be shorter. But I want to leave you with one other thought about potentially addictive behaviors. When I learned about supernormal stimuli, it really changed the way I thought about addiction and changed the way I thought about technology. So this term, supernormal stimuli, was actually developed in the 50s and 60s. And they were doing studies on animals. And what they found is if they created an artificial, exaggerated imitation of something in nature, they could make animals prefer the artificial imitation over the natural stimulus it was based on. So they did this with birds' eggs. So they created larger, more colorful birds' eggs and found that mother birds would neglect their own eggs to sit on and protect these large, colorful, exaggerated versions of a natural egg. Same thing they did with fish. I don't know anything about animals studies, but apparently male fish are attracted to female fish that have rounder bellies. I don't know. So they created these artificial fake fish that had unnaturally round bellies, and the male fish went to the fake female fish, neglecting the real female fish. So that's where this term supernormal stimuli kind of came from in the 50s and 60s, but it's been applied to today. So think about what are the artificial, exaggerated imitations that exists in our world today. A lot of it is linked to technology, but it's also linked to food. So I like to start with a food example because I think it's easy for us to wrap our brains around. There are foods in nature that are sweet. They have natural sugar in them. So take a strawberry that has natural sugar. We need that sugar for energy, for calories, so we can, our ancestors could outrun a bear or hunt and gather, whatever they did. So we need this natural sugar. But we now have artificial, exaggerated imitations of natural sugar that is much more concentrated, refined, processed. So there's much more in the food that we eat than would ever be found in nature. So I always use the example, because I just did Halloween with my nieces and nephews last semester, of pixie sticks. Why are we still giving these to children? So they are just a tube that's full of sugar, right? So after a child has pixie stick, how much do they want strawberry? Right? The concentrated refined sugar of the pixie stick, it just dwarfs the natural sugar found in a strawberry. And so candy, these desserts, this highly processed, ultra-processed foods, they can be considered super normal stimuli. They are artificial exaggerations of what you would find in nature. And what is so dangerous about supernormal stimuli is the essence of the supernormal stimulus is that the exaggerated imitation can exert a stronger pull than the real thing. We start to prefer these imitations over what we find in nature. It can be more rewarding and cause more dopamine release. Another example is pornography. So we also know that more dopamine is released with novelty. And so if you think about the artificial, exaggerated versions of potential romantic partners and sexual partners found in pornography, and you can have countless tabs open, there's always new videos to see, new images to see, all of this novelty, and then compare that to an offline romantic partner who might not be exaggerated or artificial in the same way that online pornography portrays people to be. Individuals can begin to prefer pornography over an offline sexual partner because it is this supernormal stimulus. It's this artificial exaggeration of a natural instinct for sexual activity. The online gaming world has also been called a supernormal stimulus because in the offline world, sometimes we're bored. There are lulls in our day. I hope you're not bored right now, but sometimes we are bored. But in gaming, there is no dull moment. There is not a lull in the game. There's always something to do. There's always something to see. It is extremely stimulating. And so people start to prefer the online gaming world because it is more rewarding. It is this artificial imitation of the offline world. So they start to prefer it more than their offline environment. The last supernormal stimulus example is social media. So social media creates these artificial imitations of ourselves, right? So think about beautification filters, especially if I am a teenage girl and when I am on social media, I'm using these filters that correct any blemish or any imperfection I feel like I have in my appearance, compared to the offline world where I have to talk to people face to face with all of my imperfections. People can start to prefer communication and interactions online where they have these beautification filters as opposed to our offline imperfections. So I have this picture of virtual reality just to show you that as we think about technology in particular as a supernormal stimulus, it's getting more and more advanced. So as we think about virtual reality, the studies that have come out about virtual reality pornography, We know that it is more arousing, that people can take a first-person perspective as opposed to watching others engage in sexual acts. Same with gaming, that if you game in virtual reality, it is completely immersive, more so than gaming without virtual reality. So we're just seeing these artificial, exaggerated imitations of natural instincts becoming more and more powerful as technology develops. Another example of this, so if you think about what a child would choose to play with, if you gave them crayons, blocks, dolls, or a phone, or a smartphone, what are kids gonna go for? 100% of the time, it doesn't matter what those other options are. Why? It is so stimulating, right? So Michael Mintz, who's a clinical psychologist, said, babies are attracted to the bright colors and lights of smartphones. Our phones are extremely stimulating and, in a sense, unnatural. That is to say, the lights and images that come from our phones are unlike anything a child might see in their natural environment. As such, our brains are not designed to engage with this level of stimulation, which is one reason why it's so easy for people, adults and kids alike, to get addicted to them. So he's not using the term, but that's a super normal stimulus. It's going to dwarf the reward of things that are found in natural environments and say, this is a more stimulating and a more rewarding option every time. So that's what we see with phones and why I do a presentation called Raising Kids in a Digital Age, because so many parents have concerns about digital media use with their children and their youth. Okay. So you got agent, right? So when we think about potentially addictive behaviors, they are behaviors that stimulate a reward circuitry in the brain, causing a release of dopamine and other neurotransmitters implicated in reward. They are both positively and negatively reinforcing. A lot of them use some form of variable ratio reinforcement scheduling, and a lot of them are supernormal stimuli. So those are the potentially addictive behaviors. But what about the host? Why do some people develop a behavioral addiction and others don't? Remember, we talked about at the beginning, there are certain risk factors that increase an individual's susceptibility or vulnerability to developing an addiction. And those risk factors, again, here, genetic predisposition. So there has been some awesome research that has come out in the last couple of years looking at the brains of people who end up with addiction to say, were there differences at birth? One of the studies that just came out in 2023, they found that for individuals who developed addiction, they had polymorphisms or abnormalities in their brain specifically related to dopamine receptors. So if you're like, okay, you're getting too neuroscience, I don't need to know all that. What you need to know is that some people are born with abnormalities or differences in their reward pathway. So from birth, they may have fewer dopamine receptors than another person, which means their experience of reward is different from birth. So that's the genetic predisposition, which is, again, not the whole picture, but a piece of this picture. Malfunctioning of the brain's reward center is increasingly understood to underline all addictive behaviors. So that can be from birth if there are differences in dopamine signaling and reward sensitivity, that could increase a person's vulnerability to developing addiction. So we know genetics plays a part. We also know that early exposure plays a part. So just like we've talked about, during adolescence, the prefrontal cortex has not fully myelinated. So when we talk about myelination, that's the maturing process of the brain. So neurons in our brain, they communicate with one another, but as the brain matures or develops, this myelin sheath, it's like a fatty sheath, it wraps around part of that neuron that makes it communicate faster. So someone tried to explain to me that like insulation on a wire makes things go faster through. I'm not handy and I know nothing about that. So I don't know why I keep bringing that up in my presentations because I never really know how to explain it. But what we know is when that myelin sheath wraps around the neuron, its ability to communicate speeds up. So it's as if the limbic region or the emotional processing region of the brain, the reward region of the brain, is working faster, it's louder in an adolescent's brain than that prefrontal cortex, which hasn't myelinated yet. It will finish myelinating around 24, 25, 26 years old. So it's as if the part of our brain that says, oh, that felt good, let's do it again, is very loud, and the part of our brain that says, think about the last time you engaged in that behavior. Did that turn out well? Do we want to do that again? Didn't you have all these negative consequences? That part of an adolescent's brain is softer. And so it's really this, that's why adolescents are more susceptible to rewarding behaviors. They seek them out more. They return to them once they experience them. They have a louder, faster moving emotional processing part of the brain than they do the self-regulating, inhibitory, control, goal-oriented thinking part of the brain. So adolescents are much more sensitive to rewards and they are more motivated to return to them. This is why the majority of addictive behaviors begin in adolescence. When I worked in outpatient treatment, if you asked any of my clients who by the time they came to me were in their 40s and 50s and had all these negative consequences in their life, when was your first drink or use of a drug? It was almost always during the adolescent years. So this is a very critical time for us to be aware of addiction. So early exposure matters. When you throw in a supernormal stimulus to a developing brain, it can actually change how the brain develops. It can change our natural set point for pleasure to anticipate more of it because we've been exposed to this very stimulating supernormal stimulus. Also, another risk factor that makes individuals more susceptible to behavioral addictions is trauma. So when we think about trauma, we know that it has a lot of different outcomes. It can cause a lot of different reactions to people who experience it. Not all individuals experience a traumatic event the same way. Some people develop a hyperarousal, so they're living in fight or flight mode. Others go the other direction and experience hypoarousal, so they're numb. It's as if they're living in the freeze mode. You've heard of fight, flight, or freeze. So if you are hypoaroused, you've just detached from your emotional experiences, you're numb. So people who experience trauma can go through life this way, either hyperaroused or hypoaroused. For individuals who experience chronic trauma, that can lead to what's been called toxic stress. So normal stress is healthy and it helps us survive. So if a tiger came into this room, we would all have the same stress response, that we would be in fight or flight mode, our breathing would get really shallow, our hearts would start beating really fast. If you tried to have us do a math problem or spell a word, we're not gonna do it well because we're very focused on the threat and the danger. Our muscles are tense. We are ready to either run or fight this tiger. That is a natural stress response. That is what's supposed to happen to keep us alive. But and then when the tiger walks away, we return to baseline. Our stress response dissipates and we no longer have stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline coursing through us. We go back to baseline. But think about a child who lives in the house with the tiger, or the tiger lives in the neighborhood, and trauma is chronic and prolonged and unpredictable, and there's not a attuned caregiver that serves as a buffer from the impact of this trauma. Their stress response system may become dysregulated. And so they may go through life with an activated stress response. So just like how we would feel if a tiger came in, that's how they live day to day. So they have these stress hormones constantly coursing through them, cortisol and adrenaline. It's difficult for them to learn or focus in school because they're thinking about the threat, they're thinking about the danger. They have it can look like ADHD, and it's really a trauma response of paying attention to anything that's out of the ordinary or could be a threat or could be danger. When individuals have this dysregulated stress response and chronically elevated levels of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, and then they come across a supernormal stimulus that provides an escape from that hyperarousal, it can be very hard to walk away from. So individuals with a dysregulated stress response may experience gaming or gambling or this chance to just escape in another world and to get away from those trauma symptoms for a little bit as extremely reinforcing and very difficult to walk away from. Those who are hypo-aroused, so they go through life because of trauma just completely numb. They are detached from their emotions, they don't feel anything. They may come across one of the behavioral addictions that's excitatory in nature, like a sexual activity, exercise, or non-suicidal self-injury. And that may be a temporary escape from feeling nothing. They may engage in these behaviors just to feel something. So behavioral addictions, some of them have calming effects like gaming and gambling. Some have excitatory effects. So if you are struggling with hyperarousal or hypoarousal because of early trauma, again, this can be a way of coping with that distress. And that is what we see in the data. So if you look at this chart, you've heard of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. These are traumatic experiences that happen between the ages of 0 and 18. So on this first row, that is individuals who would say, I've had no ACEs, so no traumatic experiences between 0 and 18. That second row of the table is for individuals who have had 4 or more adverse childhood experience categories in their early life, 0 to 18. I want you to just look at how the percentages of these addictive behaviors increase. So looking at alcohol use disorder, 2.5% of those who had no trauma met criteria for alcohol use disorder, but it jumped up to 9.7% for those who had 4 or more categories of adverse childhood experiences. You can look across the rest of this table and just see how the numbers jump. That when individuals experience more trauma in childhood, they are at more risk of all of these addictive behaviors with substances, but also severe obesity, which speaks to food addiction, having 50 or more sexual partners, which speaks to sex addiction, and then problem gambling. So just like genetics, trauma isn't the whole picture, but it's an important piece of the picture. It is a risk factor for an individual's increased susceptibility to addiction. There's also been some recent studies that have linked childhood trauma. It's a significant predictor to internet gaming disorder, and then also a significant predictor for social media addiction. So it's a very robust relationship between early trauma and later addictive behaviors. And we've known this since the 1990s. So the biggest adverse childhood experience study, it was conducted in 1996. That's where a lot of these relationships between early trauma and adult addictive behavior was found. And Felitti, one of the researchers on that big study, it was 1998, sorry, in that big study, he said to explain this relationship, the linking mechanisms appear to center on behaviors such as smoking, alcohol or drug abuse, overeating, or sexual behaviors that may be consciously or unconsciously used because they have immediate pharmacological or psychological benefits as coping devices. So what we knew back in 1998 is if you've experienced trauma in childhood, you are at higher risk of developing an addiction later in life because remember, people with addiction are addicted to changing the way that they feel. So if you are dysregulated in your stress response because of trauma and you're hyperaroused or hypoaroused, but you can change how you feel reliably and predictably by using a drug of abuse or engaging in a potentially addictive behavior, that could be seen as the answer. That could be seen as the coping mechanism to help people deal with those trauma symptoms. So trauma is another risk factor for developing an addiction. Okay, so we've talked about 2 of the 4. The last 2 go by really quickly. So the agent is the rewarding behavior that's stimulating the reward pathway in the brain. The host is the individual that has varying degrees of susceptibility or vulnerability to addiction based on risk factors. But what about the environment? The environment really matters because I think this helps us answer the question, why did that person become addicted to this behavior rather than this behavior? A lot of that is influenced by what's available in the environment, what's easily accessible. So when we think about the environment or the setting in which an individual is exposed to a potentially addictive behavior, we look at availability and accessibility. So it's not surprising to anyone that in countries where there is more internet access, more technology, and more Wi-Fi, we see higher rates of all of the technology-based behavioral addictions, right? And that is just because it's available, it's easy to access. We see a big digital divide when it comes to behavioral addictions based on each country's Wi-Fi access and technology. We also notice differences with legal considerations. So in countries or communities where some of these potentially addictive behaviors are illegal and harder to access, we see less prevalence as opposed to those countries and communities where it's easier to access because there are no legal ramifications. Sports betting is a big part of the conversation right now when we're talking about behavioral addictions because it is live and legal in 38 states and DC. And there are other states that are in the process of making it legal to engage in sports betting. So those of us in the behavioral addictions world really interested to see how that's going to impact gambling addiction prevalence rates now that it is so much easier to engage in sports betting. Like how many of you have seen a commercial for FanDuel or DraftKings? It is becoming just more and more accessible, available. There's more exposure to it. It's being modeled. So all of those things impact our experience with these potentially addictive behaviors. Social learning is a big part of it. So if you're in a community where you have seen people regulate their emotions through gambling that's been modeled for you, then you may go try that and say, this could be a way I could regulate my emotions too. There's also differences in marketing and advertising. And this is where, again, we want to put on our advocacy hats because in less affluent communities, we see not only more alcohol and tobacco ads, but more opportunities for gambling, for the lottery, for other types of addictive behaviors as well. There are these targeting practices where not every community has the same exposure to some of these potentially addictive behaviors. And then it also just matters about social norms. So some of these behavioral addictions, like exercise addiction and work addiction, they may actually be celebrated in some communities. We're saying, oh, you are so fit. You're going for a run even though it's raining out. You're going for a run even though you're sick. Wow, your fitness is amazing. So we could actually celebrate some of these potentially addictive behaviors. Overworking is another one that, oh, you worked 80 hours this week? That's admirable, rather than saying, I wonder, what are you getting from working? What's happening with your adrenaline in your brain and all of these things? Is there potentially a work addiction here? So that's why the environment matters so much. And then the last part of this conceptualization model is the vector. So remember, when it came to infectious diseases, the vector is what transmits the germ or the pathogen to the host that's susceptible to this disease. That could be a mosquito, that could be a tick. If we think about substance use disorders, vector could be the drug dealer or the pharmaceutical company, the ones that are getting this into the hands of potentially vulnerable individuals. When it comes to behavioral addictions, just think about all of the companies, the stakeholders, the people who benefit from individuals spending a lot of time in a particular activity or on a device using a particular app. So there are organizations and businesses and stakeholders who benefit from connecting potentially vulnerable or susceptible individuals to these potentially addictive behaviors. Tristan Harris is an individual who left Google because of some ethical concerns, and he is in the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. He talks a lot about the persuasive technology that's being used in some of these games and apps that youth are using and adults are using. He talks about this persuasive technology as the race to the bottom of the brainstem. So you all know what that means, because the base of the brainstem, this is the primitive part of the brain. This is, he's saying, we're gonna try to circumvent the prefrontal cortex, where people are making rational decisions about their engagement in behavior, and instead, can we activate the dopamine system and get people to engage because it's a craving or because there's a really strong urge. A great example of this, I think, is the notification symbol that we can have on our phones for apps. So we can look down at our phone and see that bright red circle that tells us, oh, a reward is waiting. Click on this app, there is something waiting for you. That's what this notification symbol means. Our brains are so sophisticated and powerful that at first, the dopamine is released when we experience the reward. But over time, the brain learns what is leading up to the reward. And we can actually have dopamine release when we see a cue for that reward. So that notification symbol is serving as a cue, saying there's a social reward waiting for you. Doesn't matter what you're doing right now. Are you on a date? Are you talking to someone? Are you driving? It doesn't matter. You've got to see what is that social reward. So we click on it based on this urge, this compulsivity, rather than an intentional choice that now is a good time to check social media. So that's why sometimes with my students and my clients, one of the best things we can do is turn off notifications so that you have more control over when you want to check social media, rather than it being the result of this gut level urge because you had a little dopamine hit from looking at a cue. So that's where Vector matters, that there are these strategies or this persuasive technology that's being used to keep us engaged for longer. This is another quote I like from a book called Irresistible, talking about why tech is so irresistible today. Alter said, "The people who create and refine tech games and interactive experiences are very good at what they do. They run thousands of tests with millions of users to learn which tweaks work and which ones don't, which background colors, fonts, and audio tones maximize engagement and minimize frustration." So again, it's very intentional on the part of the Vector to have individuals engaged for as long as possible in this potentially addictive behavior. And that's where, when you start thinking about children using some of these apps and devices, it's putting a child with a brain that has not fully myelinated and matured yet up against some very powerful persuasive technology. And we say, hope it works out. But it doesn't make sense that it's not a fair fight for us to put kids in that situation. I don't know if you are aware, last year, the Surgeon General said that 13 was too young for social media. I thought that was huge. So to have someone say, I've looked at the data, I've looked at the research, and even though these social media platforms say that it's for 13 and older, I'm saying, as a Surgeon General who's looked at all this, that 13 is too young to be on social media. Instead, he threw out numbers like 16, 17, and 18, and I was like, yes. Thank you. This is so great to have this authority figure saying this is not appropriate for someone that young, and talked about all the harms that they can be exposed to. So that is the way that we can conceptualize behavioral addiction. So when people ask questions like, why can't you just stop? What's a behavioral addiction anyway? And aren't we all just addicted to something? I think this is a very solid way to present behavioral addictions to others. That no, you can't be addicted to anything. It's just those behaviors that activate the reward circuitry in the brain that are positively and negatively reinforcing. Not everyone has the same degree of susceptibility to behavioral addictions. There are risk factors to consider, like genetic predisposition and trauma. The environment matters. What is accessible? What's available? What's legal? And then vector also matters. So what are those mechanisms that are connecting susceptible individuals to these potentially addictive behaviors, and what strategies are they using? So all of those things factor into the development of a behavioral addiction. And again, I think that's helpful for our work if we're in the mental health field, but also just to explain to our clients and their families so that we move away from that moral model of addiction and instead are relying on a much more science and research-based model of what contributes to addiction. Okay, so it is 11:20, so we've got about 40 minutes left, and I want to talk about gaming, social media, and cybersex. So again, I have more than what we'll get to today. But just so I know kind of where to spend my time, if you came here today saying, gosh, I really hope she's gonna talk about gaming, raise your hand. What about social media? What about sex and cybersex? Okay, all right. So we're gonna touch on each of them, but I'll spend a little bit more time with social media. So when we think about internet gaming, there's a couple of things for us to be aware of. So there's lots of different types of games. When I ask students, like, how many of you game? There's usually one or two people that raise their hand. And I say, so how many of you play Candy Crush or Wordle or another game on your phone or social media? And then it's like, oh, I didn't know you meant that too. So lots of different forms of gaming. The MMOs, the massively multiplayer online games, like League of Legends and the things that might come to your mind when you think of online gaming, they are most associated with gaming addiction. And these MMOs, it's important that if you're not a gamer, you have a sense of what's happening here. So these are individuals who are logging on and entering into a virtual space as an avatar or a character or a champion. They're called different things. But they are competing with other people in real time across the globe. So it is a completely immersive experience. There are lots of different types of MMOs that you can game and play. There's also ways to communicate with other users. So it offers social rewards and social reinforcement through either text communication or voice communication with other gamers. That's important also to know for our parents in our communities, that you should know if your child is talking to someone they don't know in a game. And I usually, when I do that presentation, I ask parents, how old do you want your child to be before they would talk to a stranger without you there? And that's what we need to think about when it comes to gaming. So the game has to tell you if there's user interaction between users. So if there is, that means that a child or adolescent could be talking to another gamer either through voice or text communication that they may not know. And so that is a risk to be aware of, and there's a lot for parents to have to learn in today's digital age. But so there is communication, unlimited challenges, tons of novelty. So these games are always being updated with patches. There's visual stimulation, an extremely rewarding experience to game. And not only is it a rewarding experience, but it could also be a potential career goal for some individuals to become a professional gamer. Now, in this day of esports, we have global tournaments and even fantasy esport teams, which is a little meta if you think about it. But just to show you some stats here on esports, according to Esports Insider, total esport viewership was 2.76 billion hours in 2023. So that's how huge this is. There are professional gamers that make millions of dollars for winning tournaments. Also, there are more than 240 colleges in the US that are associated with the National Association of Collegiate Esports, many of which offer scholarships for high schoolers to come game on their esport team. So I have written a book on behavioral addictions, and for each chapter, I interviewed someone who specialized in that particular behavioral addiction. So I got to talk to Dr. Hillary Cash a couple of times, and she founded and ran the first residential treatment facility in the US for gaming addiction. And so when I was talking to her, she just mentioned what a weird time it is that someone could go to college on a scholarship for the same activity that has brought another person into residential treatment because they've had so many negative consequences because of this addictive behavior. So we need to understand that there is the risk for addiction when it comes to gaming, but there are a lot of people who game and never meet the criteria for addiction. That's why we remember that 4 C's model, that just because they're gaming a lot doesn't mean they have a gaming addiction. Is it compulsive? Is it out of control? Are there negative consequences? Are they craving gaming when they're not engaging? So that's what we want to be thinking about. Just some prevalence rates here. It's across the globe. We have American college students, 5.3% met criteria for internet gaming disorder. If you look at gamers, about 17.8% met criteria for gaming disorder. It used to be more males than females were gamers, but now about 46% of all gamers are females, so we're seeing those gender differences kind of disappear. The piece I think is really important for us when we think about how to conceptualize, how to assess, how to work with gaming disorder is to look at the motive behind the gaming behavior. So any Adlerians out there who adhere to that principle that all behavior serves a function. So what is the function of gaming for this particular client? There are different motives. One could just be recreation, that this is what kids do today. This is what they do to pass the time, a leisure activity. There's the motive to connect with others in a social way. So I don't have anything else to talk to my friends at school about if I'm not gaming. This is just a way for me to have some relationships and to build friends. Another motive is achievement. So consider the adolescent who maybe is not good at math or not great at his studies, maybe not a great athlete, but they're really good at gaming. They feel worthwhile when they're gaming. They have respect from other people when they're gaming. This achievement motivation is really powerful. They feel successful when they're gaming. They have higher self-worth. And then the last motive is immersion or to escape. So I don't want to be my offline self. I want to be my avatar in this online world. I prefer the online world to the offline world. I want to escape the family conflict or the mental health concerns or the issues that I have offline by becoming my avatar online. As you can imagine, the achievement and immersion motivations are more linked with gaming addiction. So we need to be asking adolescents and our adult clients who we think, okay, I'm hearing the 4 C's, there might be gaming addiction here. We need to ask, what does gaming do for you? When do you feel the strongest desire to game or the strongest urge to game? What are the benefits of gaming for you? Why do you game? To help understand the motives. Because we're not going to treat all clients with gaming addiction the same way. We're going to tailor our interventions and how we work with this client based on their individual experiences. And so that can vary based on their motive. So I'm going to skip through a couple. Just wanted you to know that internet gaming disorder has been proposed for the DSM for those who work in the mental health field. It was not included in the DSM-5, but it's in the section in need of further study. It was included, however, in the ICD-11. So the International Classification of Diseases back in 2018, this is put out by the World Health Organization. Mental health professionals in the US tend to use the DSM-5, but I've spoken to folks in a lot of different countries and they all use the ICD. And so for the World Health Organization to recognize gaming disorder in 2018 was a really big step forward in behavioral addictions and increasing access to treatment because there's now a ICD-11 code. Just some negative consequences for us to be aware of. So this is where when parents ask me, is gaming good or bad? Moderate gaming has been linked to some potentially good outcomes. So moderate gaming has been linked to increased response time, increased communication and collaboration skills, enhanced spatial skills, peer relationships. So not all gaming appears to be bad. There's actually companies that are using, they're called serious games or educational games as a way to train people. So EMTs might do something in a game before they do it out in real life. So there are some benefits to technology and to gaming, but gaming has also been linked to increased depressive symptoms, increased anxiety, family conflict, and a lot of times we just think about parents and adolescents when it comes to family conflict, but with gaming, it can also be between spouses, romantic partners. There's a term called a gamer widow where an individual feels like they have lost their romantic partner to gaming, so it can cause a lot of conflict. Poor sleep, poor diet, lower GPA, more conduct problems, all of these things have been linked to gaming as well. Gaming addiction, some of the big negative consequences that we see are financial. So youth who might be stealing a parent's credit card or using a parent's credit card without permission to spend money in the game. There's also neglect of self-care and personal hygiene. So individuals who aren't showering, aren't eating, aren't sleeping because they don't want to leave the virtual world. These MMOs, they continue even when the individual user has logged off. So there's this urgency to get back into the game. And then we also see lack of physical activity, high caffeine intake, physical ailments, and loneliness, which I think is so fascinating because a lot of people say, but all of my best friends are in the game. I want to game because that's where all my friends are. But people with gaming addiction have higher loneliness scores, which I think speaks to the fact that virtual relationships are different from offline relationships. We just can't compare virtual relationships to what happens when people are in the same space with each other. We're seeing these loneliness scores. And then there are withdrawal symptoms for individuals who have gaming addiction. If they are unable to game, they experience cravings to game, impatience, lack of pleasure, irritability, anger, anxiety. There's actually a term called gamer rage, which is it just speaks to the high volatility, emotional volatility that comes with gaming, that if an individual is unable to game, they may punch a wall or break something or harm themselves, and that's called gamer rage. So for those of you who are in the mental health field, you have in your packet some assessment instruments and treatment considerations for working with gaming addiction. The big thing that's going to transcend gaming addiction, social media addiction, and cybersex addiction, since they all have this technology component, is to help your client and your client's family develop a technology plan. So what are the guidelines for how this person is going to live in a world where we are reliant on technology without engaging in that specific addictive behavior? So it could be filters and blocking software that's put on the Wi-Fi in the house. It could be that they don't have access to their own device. They might have to have their device being supervised by someone else and they have to ask for it and then it's under supervision. There's a lot of things that we can do to help our clients develop this technology plan so they know how to move forward in a technological world without relapsing. Almost all treatment for the digital-based behavioral addictions have some form of abstinence for a period of time from all screens. And part of that is to allow the brain to go back to baseline before it had these spikes of dopamine that came from gaming or gambling and online shopping and cyber sex activities. That can actually cause changes in the brain. So there is 90 days typically of just no screens, total absence from all digital technology to allow the brain to go back to baseline before they started engaging, but also to help the client start to rely on natural rewards again. So rather than waiting for that supernormal stimulus to give them the positive and negative reinforcement, how can they find reward in nature, in a good conversation with someone, in a team sport, in art? How can they rely on natural rewards again rather than the supernormal stimuli? So that's a big part of treatment for all of them. With social media, you have this information about 13 being too young from the Surgeon General, but a couple other things I wanted us to look at, and specifically I'm going to jump to the characteristics of social media that make it irresistible or potentially addictive. So I teach an addictions class, and my students have to abstain from something desirable for the whole semester. So some of my counselor ed friends, they only make them do it for like 6 weeks or 8 weeks. I do it for the whole 15 weeks. Because part of what I'm trying to communicate to my students is you're going to work with clients in the future and you're going to ask them to abstain from drugs of abuse or a behavioral addiction for the rest of their lives. There's no end date for them. So can you get through 15 weeks without something that you desire? And it's just a way to build empathy for what we're asking our future clients to do. So my first lecture, I really lay it on thick, and I say things like, I want you to watch yourself for a week. What do you turn to cope with negative emotions? When you're bored, when you're lonely, when you're sad, when you're angry, what do you turn to? Is it comfort food? Is it social media? Is it alcohol? What is it that you turn to self-soothe or to make yourself feel better when you are in a negative mood state? Out of those things, which one is least in line with your personal goals and values, your personal wellness goals? That's what I want you to pick to abstain from for the whole 15 weeks. And so I even tell them, if as I'm describing this assignment, something pops in your head and you're like, oh, I'm never giving that up. That's what I want you to consider giving up for this semester. Challenge yourself. We're trying to build empathy for our future clients with addiction. So they have a week to think about it. And they come back and they either are abstaining from caffeine, some abstain from alcohol, some have abstained from vaping. I would say 40 to 50% of every class self-selects to give up social media. That they say, I turn to this to self-soothe, I turn to it when I'm bored, lonely, depressed, anxious, and it is least in line with my goals and values because it does nothing for me. Like they come to that conclusion on their own. And guess how many make it the whole semester without checking social media? Yeah, very, very few. And if the ones who do, they're usually like kind of white knuckling it till the end, and then it's like scrolls over for days. But they end up with the same rationalizations that our clients say. It's like, but Dr. G, my mom's best friend's cousin was getting married and I had to see those pictures. I couldn't not see the pictures. So they come up with rationalizations and justifications to get back on social media and break their abstinence contract. So I think talking about social media and its addictive properties is easy because a lot of people recognize them. A lot of people say, I know I spend too much time on social media. I can self-report that. So some of the characteristics, which again were intentional choices to design the product this way, is the feedback features. So seeing feedback, getting that reward, that reinforcement from someone liking something that you said or sharing what you said is a very powerful form of reinforcement, especially for adolescents when you think about how important peer relationships are to youth. During adolescence, peers are so important, and so to have peers like your things online is very meaningful for an adolescent compared to maybe a 35-year-old. Also, the filters that we already talked about, photo editing capabilities, influencers that are seen as these experts on topics and have very large audiences that they can motivate or persuade. The other piece that I think we really need to consider when we think about social media addiction is the use of an algorithm. So you've heard about this, that social media uses algorithms, and this is a way to collect data on individual social media users, feed it into this algorithm then that says, okay, based on what she likes and what she clicks on and what she has watched, other people who have that same profile also like these things. So let's show her those things. So some people are like, I have no problem with that because, if I'm shopping for shoes and it shows me more shoes, that just makes the shopping experience easier. But what are some potential drawbacks of the algorithm? Say that again? Yep. So you start seeing only things that confirm your previously held beliefs or preferences. So you're not exposed to this diverse viewpoints, but it tends to show you things that already confirm what you think. It's also very hard to stop or limit social media use when that very next video that pops up after half a second of a delay is another artist you love or an influencer that you love or something else that you like. So if you have said, I'm only going to spend 15 minutes on social media and then I've got to write that paper, and I'm on social media and I'm scrolling and then it's like, okay, this is my last video. And then as soon as it ends, another one comes on that is exactly fit to my tastes. And I'm like, oh, I can't not watch that one. That is exactly what I'm looking for. All of a sudden, hours go by. Has anyone experienced that where you're like, it is 3:00 in the afternoon. I've done nothing today, because we can get so lost. Another part of social media that is different than what we've seen in the past, like movies and books that have a natural stopping point. There's no natural stopping point to social media. You could stay on it all day long and get flooded with novel pictures, novel posts to read, and novel videos. So there's no natural endpoint. Also, with those algorithms, you should check the terms of use for the social media platforms that you have. They're really open and transparent about all the data they're collecting on their users. So everything we click on, we hover over, things that we watch in its entirety, things that we share, all of that is data that is being collected by these platforms. And they let people know, but that is what's feeding this algorithm that shows us content that we're likely to really enjoy. Fear of missing out is another real anxiety that's not only faced by adolescents, but adults as well. So fear of missing out, this anxiety that my friends are doing something and I'm not a part of it, or I'm missing this latest joke or thing that's going viral, is a real anxiety that has been linked to greater social media addiction scores. And so especially with adolescents, when we have the importance of the peer group, to think, oh, what if there's something going on, or a party or an event, something that's happening that I'm not a part of because I'm not online at this second. So there's this urgency to always be connected, to always be on social media. The other piece of social media that I think is very cunning is it's not just about posting anymore, right? Like, what else do you do on social media? Almost everything. We check our news, we host events, we invite people to those events, we buy and sell things. There's now dating options. There is so much that happens on a social media app. It's almost like we can't live without it. And think about the intentionality behind that is let's have it do a little bit of everything. So if your child is not on social media, they're missing out on this, this, and this. I speak to parents quite a bit and counselors who work in schools, and they say, for that one child that's not on social media, but their entire soccer team is, and that's how they get all their information, that's how they know when to show up for practice, what are they supposed to do? And that's why actually the Surgeon General said if parents would band together and say, let's use something else. So, hey, soccer team parents, let's go back to texting or email or something that doesn't require my child to be on social media. That would be an intentional choice that would have to be made to say you don't have to rely on social media. It's not indispensable. So the fear of missing out, just some of the negative consequences that we've seen with social media use and social media addiction, anxiety and depression, low levels of self-esteem, particularly among adolescent females, higher levels of narcissism because it's very self-focused, right? Family conflict, poor sleep quality. How many of you scroll when you can't go to sleep? We all do it. We know it's not helpful for us. No one thinks that's going to help us go to sleep better, but we still do it. So poor sleep quality, decreased social connectedness. So again, you feel like you're connected because you have 5,000 friends, but you actually feel lonely. You don't have that sense of belonging. Another piece is that higher social media addiction scores predicted cyberbullying perpetration. So people who spend a lot of time on social media, engaging in social media, they may start to engage in cyberbullying. And you're like, why? What would be the connection there? One of the hypotheses is that the online environment tends to be a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more hostile than the offline environment, right? People say things in comments that you wouldn't say to someone face to face. And so there's this level of aggression and hostility and toxicity online and in social media platforms that we don't see offline. So cyberbullying is another concern. Also, outside of social media addiction, social media is the #1 platform for cyberbullying right now. So it used to be offline bullying, and then it was texting. Now it's social media where we see the most cyberbullying happen. So there's assessment instruments, and there are treatment considerations for you to peruse if you're interested. And let's spend the last few minutes we have talking about sex and cyber sex addiction. So I always like to start this part of the presentation by saying what sex addiction is not. Sex addiction is not poor sexual decision making. So of course that's something we can talk about in counseling, but we wouldn't call it sex addiction unless it's meeting those 4 C's, right? Someone who did something sexually that they later regret. Yes, let's talk about it in counseling. That in and of itself does not warrant the label of an addiction. I also just want to note here that it's not a man's issue. So when I do presentations specifically on sex and cyber sex, I try to use as many different pronouns as I can because I have worked with female clients with sex addiction who have expressed this extra layer of shame, of saying, not only do I feel shame because I have an addiction, but I feel shame because I am a woman with sex or pornography addiction, where I feel like society is more forgiving or accepts it a little bit more among those who identify as male. And so I think it's really important for us to recognize that sex addiction, cyber sex addiction impacts men and women. You can see some prevalence rates here. About 6% of the general population has been hypothesized to have sex addiction. With the emergence of the internet, we have seen sex addiction rates go up. And that is because of the availability and the accessibility of online pornography and cyber sex. So I want to talk specifically about cyber sex, and you have some other information about sex addiction here. But we used to see what was called the classic type of sex addiction. So people coming to treatment for this compulsive, out of control sexual activity that they were experiencing all sorts of negative consequences, but they couldn't stop the behavior. When we looked at those clients who were coming into sex addiction treatment, many of them had histories of trauma. They had attachment issues in their family of origin, and they had some sort of attachment wound or insecure attachment styles. And so that was what was typical. And so when it came to treatment, we did a lot of working with past trauma, working with family of origin issues. But then all of a sudden, we had people coming into treatment for sex addiction that didn't meet that profile. So they didn't seem to have any trauma. They didn't have these family of origin issues, these attachment wounds. Instead, the common denominator was early exposure to pornographic material online. So early exposure to this sexually explicit material on the internet. And so that leads us to what we call the contemporary type of sex addiction that is being fueled by early exposure to the supernormal stimulus of pornography or cybersex. So although I use those terms almost interchangeably, it's important to recognize that pornography is just one type of cybersex. Cybersex includes any type of sexual stimulation that uses technology. Pornography is the most prevalent, but there's also real-time partnered acts, live-streamed audio pornography, pornographic material on social media, sexually explicit content in games, sharing sexual images via text, so sexting or private messaging, and just a little bit of data about the pornography industry. We see various types of internet pornography, and when you look at some of the reported data, so Pornhub and YouPorn, they released their data, and Pornhub said that 92 million users visit the site daily. The average age of the user, and this is self-report, it's not verified, is 37 years old. YouPorn said they had 4 billion visits in 2018. The most common means of accessing pornography today is free material on a smartphone. So it used to be you had to go pay for pornography or go to a location to purchase it. Now it's accessible anywhere there's Wi-Fi, and it's often free. So when we talk about cybersex, we are talking about what's called the It's called the AAA engine, that it is anonymous, it's accessible, and it's affordable. And this is why Patrick Carnes, who's one of the lead researchers in sex addiction, he's written a lot about how to treat sex addiction. He talked about how there is just this tsunami coming of people who have started using pornography at 11, 12, 13 years old, and by their early 20s, are either unable to be aroused from an offline sexual partner, and that's just from conditioning, right? They've conditioned themselves to be aroused from a screen, and now they're having a hard time connecting with offline romantic partners, or they're experiencing sexual dysfunction or a lot of negative consequences that's leading them into treatment. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, average age of first pornography exposure is 11 and a half. So think about that very powerful supernormal stimulus, having people whose brains are still developing being exposed to that, either intentionally or accidentally, and how that could impact their trajectory when it comes to potential sex addiction. From whatever stance you take, there are moral and religious and lots of different views on pornography use. But what we know from the research is that across the board, people agree that it is not helpful for adolescents. So the data is overwhelmingly negative about the impact of pornography use among adolescents. It tends to be prevalent. 56% of US high school students viewed pornography in the past year. And adolescent pornography exposure has been linked to sexual aggression, more permissive sexual attitudes, more dominant sexual behaviors, self-objectification or body comparison with peers, the development of sexual scripts based on pornography. And if I can just pause us there, I think we would all agree pornography is a terrible sex education teacher. We do not want our youth developing their scripts about what sex is supposed to be from pornography. It's also been linked to poor academic performance. So what we're finding is, depending upon the child's age, they may or may not have had a conversation with a caregiver about what healthy sexuality is. So they're exposed to pornography, either accidentally or intentionally, and they don't have a schema for what healthy sex is. So all of a sudden they see this confusing and potentially arousing, but also potentially traumatizing video, and they might not be able to distinguish what's healthy sexual behavior versus unhealthy. What is behavior that is adaptive versus maladaptive. So pornography for children can be a source of distress or a source of curiosity. If they haven't had a conversation with a parent about what pornography is, they may come across a video or an image and think, oh, I wasn't supposed to see that. No one's ever talked to me about what this is. Surely someone would have mentioned it if it was okay. So I probably wasn't supposed to see it. So then what do? Hide it. They never tell anyone, so there's not a chance to correct these scripts and these misperceptions that they have about pornography, letting them know that most of these people are actors, that consent is important, that violence is not a part of healthy sexuality. We can't correct those distorted thoughts if we're not having the conversation with youth. So I talk to parents about how to inform kids about pornography before they see it, so a way to set them up for success, saying something like, you know, online there are videos and there are pictures for kids and there are videos and pictures for adults. If you ever come across a video for an adult with people doing things that you don't understand or people without clothes on, it's never your fault that you saw that. Just come tell me so we can talk about it. So when that child is exposed to pornography, they're like, oh, this is that thing my caregiver told me about. I know what to do. Turn it off, go tell them, because you've already set them up for how to be successful when they come across that pornographic image. There are books, good pictures, bad pictures. There are all types of ways we can have these conversations with youth so that they know what to do when they are exposed to pornography. Unfortunately, it's not an if anymore. The other thing I did want to mention is tolerance is a part of all of these behavioral addictions. So I like this quote: when pornographers boast that they're pushing the envelope by introducing new and harder themes, what they don't say is that they must because their customers are building up a tolerance to the content. So you see new forms of pornography coming out, people needing to find novel material to reach the same level of arousal. Cyber sex addiction in particular has been linked to a variety of negative consequences for people across the lifespan. So not just adolescents, but it's been linked to marital conflict, depression, alcohol use, less satisfaction in relationships, more loneliness, financial issues, physical injury, legal issues, and there's some evidence that problematic pornography use is associated with sexual dysfunction. So things that we're seeing among younger and younger individuals that weren't typical for that age group. So hypersexual disorder has been proposed, was not included in the DSM-5, but again, the ICD does include compulsive sexual behavior disorder. So you can take a look at those criteria. When it comes to assessing sex and pornography addiction, you have that in your handout. I just wanted you to see how many 12-step programs exist for sex addiction. I think this just speaks to what a huge issue this is in society. Look at how many there are that are just related to sex addiction. The last thing I'll say about behavioral addictions in general is sometimes people ask me, well, what does abstinence look like from a behavioral addiction? Are we asking people not to engage in a sexual activity ever again or the internet ever again? Obviously not, right? Food addiction, you can't not eat. So what we do with behavioral addictions is we typically do an activity like this, where we draw these 3 concentric circles. In the innermost circle is where we have the client, after a period of sobriety and abstinence from their compulsive behavior, really think about what is the behavior that meets the 4 C's? So what behaviors are compulsive and out of control, leading to negative consequences that induces cravings? We write them in the innermost circle. The middle circle is where we identify warning signs that they're moving closer to an inner circle behavior. And then the outer circle are things that are aligned with their goals and values, they're encouraged, they are things that the individual and their sponsor or their counselor have agreed these are acceptable activities. So for this example, it might be compulsive masturbation, pornography, and anonymous sex were identified as those out of control, leading to negative consequences, behaviors that they're going to abstain from. Flirting, watching sexual content on TV, or engaging in sexual fantasies are the warning signs that they're getting closer to a relapse. And then attending Sex Addicts Anonymous, hobbies, sex within a committed relationship, all of those are the permissible or encouraged behaviors. So that's how we look at abstinence and recovery from a behavioral addictions perspective. So I have 2 minutes left with you. I want to show you some peer support groups for all of these behavioral addictions. And then, like I mentioned at the very beginning, I think the big picture prevention strategy is to teach kids at an early age that they have emotions, that they can identify those emotions, and they can regulate those emotions in healthy and adaptive ways. So teaching coping strategies, teaching emotion regulation skills. You know, Mr. Rogers, so Fred Rogers, he said when he was talking about his TV show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, said, if we in public television can only make it clear that feelings are mentionable and manageable, we will have done a great service for mental health. And I think that's so true. If kids learn this is a negative emotion, I can talk about it, and I can manage it successfully without turning to drugs of abuse or a behavioral addiction, that is a huge skill set that we are giving kids of today. There's a lot of ways we can develop emotion regulation skills, teaching youth how to identify their emotions, how to modify them, so how to tolerate distress, how to self-soothe, how to employ effective coping strategies. I actually got tired of asking my students what are examples of coping strategies, and they just told me exercise, like over and over. I'm like, there are times when your client is not gonna wanna go for a jog. That cannot be the answer for every negative emotion. So we actually came up with a list of potential coping skills that are just across the board, from spiritual and religious coping strategies, social coping strategies, distractions, all different ways that we can help kids navigate negative emotions. How can they regulate them effectively and adaptively without turning to behavioral addictions? So on that note, I will close here. I have written a couple of books, and there's a couple of courses I've made with Mental Health Academy. That QR code, I was really proud of just figuring out how to make one of those, but that takes you to my Facebook page. It's an author page about just information about behavioral addictions. I try to keep it updated, which is, I know the irony there. I just talked about social media addiction. I'm like, follow me on Facebook. So you have all of these resources, but you also have my email address. So if you want to follow up with a conversation, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. So thank you so much for being here today.
That was a lot of wonderful information. Do you have a few minutes to answer a couple of questions if we have questions from the field? I know it's 12 o'clock, so if anybody needs to sneak out, feel free to get up and sneak out now, but would love to open up the floor to if anybody has any questions. No questions. She covered everything. Oh, here we go.
Hey, I'm a mom of an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old, so I would love whatever resources you have for talking to them about porn. We have very open conversations at home, but still my 11-year-old is my boy and my 13-year-old's the girl, and so I want to be proactive about all of this.
You email me. I have some slides and resources I would be happy.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
2005.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, like, why only 2005? Like, why can't we get more accurate data? Because I think those numbers probably are
Way
significantly
different
off.
now.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so
Yep.
that was one, and then the other one was about, you mentioned that there's stuff that's, our kids are born with a predisposition as far as like, from having the dopamine
Yeah.
deficiency or whatever. Is there a way to screen for that? Okay.
And that's what's so frustrating. There's not a way to check, like, do you have an addiction gene?
Right.
It's really educating, knowing the risk, and then coming up with prevention plans. And with the data, I also just try to vary it. So at the first couple of slides are more recent data around sex addiction. I wanted to include Patrick Carnes since he was kind of the pioneer in this field, but it has gotten a lot higher than what he predicted. And so there's different stats throughout the slides. Yeah.
Two questions. One, you recommended a 90-day cease of all screen activity. How do you handle that with a child who might need to be on those because of education? And then what would your recommendation be to school systems as far as usage? Because I've seen a lot of concern from parents about especially K-5 and then the requirements that teachers and school districts are putting on their children through the education.
Huge concern. There's advocacy groups that are specifically looking at screens in schools and how do we limit that or at least push it up. You're right, like the K through 5 is a big area of concern. And so I think that's something that parents can advocate by talking to their school districts about how we would prefer there not be screens in schools. These are our rules at home. That's what we would expect from schools. So there's a lot of people engaging in that. When it comes to the period of abstinence, a lot of that is when people have met criteria for addiction and they've experienced negative consequences. So this is what has to happen. There's like agreement across the board that this has to happen. For the people who run treatment facilities for screen-related behavioral addictions, they have it set up that if you have to check your banking or if you have to check an email, you have to sign up for when you're going to use the laptop, so it's intentional, it's not just compulsive, and it's always under supervision. And so there are ways that they can still access certain aspects of technology, but it's, again, very intentional, not impulsive, it's planned, and it's supervised. Yeah.
I think that's it. Please join me in thanking Dr. Giordano for being here with us this afternoon. This was amazing. We'll leave this up here if you want to come up closer to take a picture of the QR code to get information. Thank you all for joining us today. Save the date for our next event, which will be in April 25th. And there's a QR code if you want to go ahead and sign up now so that you'll get a reminder, and it will be on the intersection of faith and mental health. Thank you.